The ventilation shaft above Deck 7's hydroponics lab was leaking again. Not that anyone but Marcus Chen could tell the CopyRetryAGwrite engineers who supposedly maintained the station's environmental systems wouldn't know a pressure differential if it slapped them across their pretentious purple scales. Yeah, I hear you," Marcus muttered to the hissing vent, fishing through his toolkit for the sonic wrench. The tool, like everything else aboard Galactic Confederation Station Delta 9, was allegedly top-of-the-line alien tech. In reality, it was about as reliable as his old coach's promises that he'd only have to do one more round of burpees. As he worked, a drop of condensation landed squarely on his nose. Perfect. Just perfect. 5 years ago, he'd been defending his heavyweight title at Madison Square Garden. Now, he was playing plumber to a bunch of aliens who thought humans were barely evolved enough to tie their own shoes. Though watching a CopyRetryAGwrite try to tie shoes with their tentacles might actually be worth the price of admission. The year was 2157, and humanity had finally joined the galactic community. To hear the CopyRetryAGwrite tell it, and boy, did they love telling it, they'd graciously allowed Earth to join the Confederation, despite our laughably primitive technology and childishly simplistic culture. The fact that humans had gone from first contact to matching their tech level in under a decade seemed to conveniently slip their minds. Speaking of slipping, Marcus grumbled, adjusting his magnetic boots as he reached deeper into the shaft. The station's artificial gravity was another marvel of alien engineering that seemed to hiccup more often than a drunk at an open bar. He couldn't help but smirk as a group of CopyRetryAGwrite warriors passed below, their ceremonial armor clicking against the deck plates like tap-dancing crabs. They were the self-proclaimed master race of the galaxy, each one convinced they could take on 10 humans in combat. Marcus had seen them training in their sacred combat arts in the station's gym. It looked like a cross between interpretive dance and an octopus having a seizure. The leak finally sealed with a satisfying hiss. Marcus began packing up his tools. His knuckles, scarred from countless rounds in the ring, brushed against the station's cold metal wall. Sometimes he missed it, the roar of the crowd, the dance of the ring, the pure science of the sweet art. But hey, at least now he got to fix climate control systems for beings who thought having 3 hearts made them superior, despite the fact that none of those hearts could handle a decent left hook. Maintenance log, update. He spoke to his comm unit. Deck 7 ventilation issue resolved. Again, marking this as the 3rd repair this month. Which is absolutely not, because someone installed the pressure regulators backwards. But what do I know? I'm just a primitive human who only learned about space travel after the CopyRetryAGwrite so kindly showed up to educate us barbarians about the wonders of the universe. The comm unit beeped in acknowledgement, probably filing his report under human maintenance drone observations low priority. That was fine by Marcus. Let them underestimate him. He'd spent his whole career being underestimated. From the local gym in Oakland, where he'd first laced up gloves, to his championship bout where he'd been a 101 underdog, to now fixing leaks on a station where half the population thought humans were one step above trained monkeys. At least the monkeys would get the ventilation system right the first time. With his tools secured, Marcus headed for the station's marketplace. His shift was over, and he had a date with a protein shake and some old Earth boxing holovids. As he walked, his trained fighter's eyes couldn't help but notice how the CopyRetryAGwrite warriors moved, all show, no substance, like amateur boxers who'd watched too many movies. All those tentacles, and not one of them knew how to throw a proper jab. Little did Marcus know, his keen observations about CopyRetryAGwrite fighting techniques were about to become a lot more relevant than fixing leaky pipes. The marketplace on Delta 9 was a sensory overload on the best of days. Today, with the station's environmental controls acting up again, the usual chaos was amplified by a lovely new feature: random bursts of warm air that made the whole place smell like a combination of alien spices and what Marcus could only describe as space gym socks. Excuse me. Pardon me. Trying to get to the climate control panel here, Marcus muttered, squeezing between a Xylaxian crystal merchant and something that looked like a sentient cloud of sparkles. His toolkit bumped against his leg as he navigated through the crowd. The marketplace's main thoroughfare wasn't exactly designed for smooth traffic flow, apparently. The Confederation's brilliant architects had never heard of crowd control. That's when he saw them, a group of CopyRetryAGwrite warriors taking up way more space than necessary with their ceremonial armor and overly dramatic posturing. Leading them was none other than Kazor the Undefeated, the self-proclaimed greatest warrior in the sector. Marcus had seen him around the station before, usually surrounded by his entourage of yes aliens who acted like every word from his 3 mouths was a cosmic revelation. Just need to squeeze past. Marcus attempted to edge around the group, but the sea of bodies in the marketplace had other ideas. A sudden surge in the crowd pushed him sideways, and his toolkit made contact with Kazor's ceremonial armor with all the grace of a rookie's first speed bag attempt. The marketplace went silent. Well, as silent as a space station marketplace could get, which meant you could only hear about 15 different species gasping in horror instead of the usual cacophony. Kazor turned slowly, all 3 of his hearts presumably racing with indignation. His scales shifted from their usual purple to a deep indigo, the Krayathac equivalent of turning red with anger. You dare lay hands upon Kazor the Undefeated, champion of the Krayathac people, master of the 17 sacred combat forms, bearer of the... Oh great, Marcus thought, here comes the title crawl. Maybe I should grab a snack while he finishes introducing himself. Destroyer of the Nexus Beast, victor of the Crimson Tournaments, and keeper of the ancient ways. Kazor finally finished, his tentacles writhing in what was probably supposed to be an intimidating display. To Marcus, it looked more like an interpretive dance number about spaghetti having an existential crisis. My bad, Marcus said, raising his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of apology. Just trying to fix the environmental controls. You know, so we all don't have to marinate in this lovely soup of aromas we've got going on. Kazor's third eye narrowed. Typical human, always hiding behind your technology. Where I come from, warriors don't fix problems with tools, they solve them with combat. The crowd had formed a circle around them now. Marcus noticed credits starting to change hands as various species began placing bets. At least someone was going to profit from this ridiculous situation. Look, Marcus tried again, unable to keep a slight smirk from forming at the corners of his mouth. I'm really not interested in any. Ha! Kazor bellowed, interpreting Marcus's expression exactly wrong. The human trembles so much he can barely maintain composure. See how fear makes his face contort. Marcus's smirk grew wider, which only served to convince Kazor further of his terror. The alien champion puffed up his chest plates, looking remarkably like a peacock that had stuck its tentacles in a power outlet. I, Kazor the Undefeated, hereby challenge you, human maintenance drone, to traditional Krayathac combat. Unless he paused dramatically, tentacles swishing for effect, you wish to admit your species' inherent cowardice before all these witnesses. Traditional Krayathac combat, Marcus mused, remembering all those training sessions he'd observed in the gym. Right, because flailing around like a squid at a rave is definitely the peak of martial arts evolution. The crowd waited with bated breath, or whatever passed for breath among the various species present for Marcus's response. He could feel the weight of the moment, the expectations of everyone watching. Here was a chance to either back down and confirm every stereotype the Krayathac had about humans, or... You know what Marcus said, his years of pre-fight press conferences kicking in. I accept your challenge. Kazor's tentacles froze mid-swish. Clearly, he hadn't expected this response. But he recovered quickly, puffing up even further, a feat Marcus wouldn't have thought possible without some kind of internal helium supply. Very well. We shall meet in 3 solar cycles for traditional Krayathac combat. I hope you are prepared to. Actually, Marcus interrupted, enjoying the way Kazor's scales rippled with annoyance. I believe the Confederation's dueling laws state that the challenged party gets to choose the style of combat. Article 7, Section 3, Subsection B, if I'm not mistaken. Those mandatory station safety briefings were finally paying off. This is correct, one of Kazor's associates confirmed, consulting a data pad with their lower tentacles. Great. Marcus's smirk blossomed into a full grin. Then I choose boxing. The marketplace erupted in confused murmuring as various species tried to figure out what this boxing was. Kazor's third eye blinked rapidly. Boxing, he pronounced the word like it might bite him. What manner of combat is this? Oh, don't worry, Marcus said, already turning to leave. It's just a primitive human martial art. Should be no problem for a warrior of your caliber. As he walked away, Marcus could hear Kazor's entourage frantically searching their databases for information about this mysterious Earth combat form. He had a feeling the next few days were going to be very interesting indeed. News traveled faster than a quantum transmission on Delta 9, especially when it involved potential violence and gambling opportunities. By the time Marcus finished his maintenance shift the next day, the station's betting pools had reached astronomical proportions, and at least 17 different species had developed their own theories about what boxing entailed. Is it true that boxing requires humans to seal themselves in containers? Asked Zip Zap, the Voltarian who ran the station's juice bar. Their electrical appendages crackled with excitement as they mixed Marcus's usual post-shift protein shake. No, that's not even close. Marcus chuckled, watching the alien's antenna droop in disappointment. Though I'd pay good credits to see Kazor try to stuff himself into a box with all those tentacles. The station's information networks were working overtime as various species tried to research human combat sports. Marcus had caught glimpses of some of the more entertaining misconceptions floating around. Boxing ancient Earth ritual, where combatants must think outside the box while remaining inside it. Leading Krothac scholars suggest this refers to a metaphysical construct. Preliminary studies indicate possible connection to human cat-in-box quantum experiments. Warning may involve dangerous levels of paradox. The Krothac themselves were taking the whole thing very seriously. They'd set up a research committee to study this mysterious Earth combat form, led by Professor Kral Tik, the sector's foremost expert on primitive species combat rituals. Marcus had spotted the professor in the station's archives, all 6 of their tentacles clutching different data pads while their third eye twitched frantically. The historical records are most confusing, he overheard the professor telling Kazor during one of their strategy sessions. There are references to something called a southpaw, yet we can find no evidence of humans having specialized appendages on their southern regions. And these boxing rings most peculiar that humans would attempt combat while wearing jewelry. Kazor, meanwhile, had taken to strutting around the station with even more pomp than usual, if such a thing were possible. He'd gathered his warriors in the station's main gymnasium, attempting to prepare for any possible interpretation of boxing. Today we practice the ancient human art of package delivery, Kazor announced to his followers, each of them standing next to a large cardboard box. We must master the way of the cube if we are to understand their combat techniques. Marcus, who happened to be passing by during this particular training session, had to stuff his fist in his mouth to keep from laughing out loud. The sight of 12 Krothac warriors solemnly attempting to fold themselves into shipping containers would have made even his old boxing coach crack a smile. But not everyone found the situation amusing. The station's diplomatic corps was in an uproar. Emergency meetings were being held to discuss the potential interspecies implications of the upcoming duel. Ambassador Zilith of the Galactic Peace Council had personally contacted Marcus to strongly suggest he reconsider. You don't understand the gravity of this situation. The ambassador's hologram had flickered as they spoke. The Krothac are sensitive about their martial traditions. Sensitive? They've spent the last year telling everyone who'll listen that humans are barely evolved enough to feed ourselves, Marcus replied, checking the wraps on his hands as he prepared for another training session. Maybe it's time they learned a little sensitivity themselves. The ambassador's crystalline form shimmered with concern. There are diplomatic implications to consider. There sure are, Marcus agreed. Like the implication that humans are tired of being treated like second-class citizens in a confederation we helped save from the Nexus swarm last year. Funny how quickly everyone forgets that. Word of Marcus's training sessions began to spread. He'd set up a small corner of the cargo bay as his gym, complete with a heavy bag he'd fabricated from spare parts and maintenance supplies. The sight of him shadowboxing drew increasingly large crowds of curious onlookers. Observe, he heard one Krothac scientist tell another. The human engages in ritual combat with an invisible opponent. Clearly, boxing involves some form of dimensional manipulation. Fascinating. And note how he bounces on his feet. Perhaps this generates quantum energy for the metaphysical box creation. The Krothac weren't the only ones getting in on the action. The station's engineers had started taking measurements for what they assumed would be some sort of combat containment cube. The quartermaster's office was fielding requests for box construction materials from various species who wanted to practice this exotic Earth sport. And the station's medical bay had begun researching human cardboard allergies, just to be on the safe side. Through it all, Marcus maintained his routine, fixed the station's perpetually malfunctioning systems by day, trained by night. He found the whole situation deliciously ironic. Here were the mighty HFY, tying themselves in literal and figurative knots, trying to decipher a sport that humans had been practicing since they first figured out how to make fists. The betting odds had started at 100-1 in Kazor's favor. As the days passed and more species witnessed Marcus's training sessions, those odds began to shift. Not that anyone really understood what they were seeing. To most of the station's residents, his workout routine looked like a bizarre combination of dancing and attacking the air. But there was something about his quiet confidence that made them wonder if perhaps there was more to this boxing than met their various types of eyes. 3 days before the scheduled duel, Kazor made one final attempt at psychological warfare. He burst into the cargo bay during Marcus's training session, all 3 hearts beating visibly through his ceremonial armor. "Human," he bellowed, tentacles writhing dramatically. "I have mastered the way of the box." Behold, he gestured to his followers, who proceeded to demonstrate their interpretation of boxing by attempting to fold themselves into increasingly smaller spaces while making boom noises. Marcus paused his speed bag routine to watch the display, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That's really something, Kazor. Really something." "Your fear is palpable," Kazor declared, interpreting Marcus's diplomatic response as terror. "In 3 days, you will face the true might of a HFY warrior who has embraced your primitive combat methods." As Kazor and his entourage swept out of the cargo bay, Marcus returned to his workout, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had a feeling this was going to be the most entertaining fight of his career, and he'd once fought a guy who thought entering the ring dressed as a mime was a good idea. The cargo bay of Delta 9 wasn't exactly Gleason's gym, but Marcus had made it work. He'd rigged up a heavy bag using a reinforced cargo container filled with decommissioned engine parts, suspended from the ceiling with magnetic locks. The speed bag was trickier. He'd had to modify a zero-gravity storage sphere, but the irregular bounces actually made for better practice. "Fascinating," muttered Dr. Kraltik, furiously taking notes as Marcus wrapped his hands. The human applies ceremonial bindings to strengthen his connection to the mythical box dimension. A small crowd had gathered for Marcus's morning workout, as usual. The HFY research team occupied their usual spot, surrounded by holographic displays showing ancient Earth boxing matches they'd somehow gotten their tentacles on. They had, unfortunately, discovered footage of the Rocky movies and were treating them as historical documentaries. According to our research, one junior researcher announced, humans gain tremendous power by ascending stairs and pursuing small animals for training. Marcus didn't bother correcting them. He started his warm-up, jumping rope with practiced ease. This simple exercise caused a wave of excited chittering among the observers. "The levitation ritual begins," Dr. Kraltik exclaimed. "Note how he generates anti-gravitational fields through rhythmic movement." Moving to shadowboxing, Marcus threw combinations into the air, his feet dancing across the cargo bay floor. He could practically hear his old coach float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and try not to laugh at the aliens having an existential crisis in the corner. "Most perplexing," a HFY warrior observed. "He appears to be fighting invisible opponents. Perhaps boxing involves combat with non-corporeal entities." The heavy bag work really got them going. As Marcus unleashed a combination jab, cross, hook, slip, uppercut, the research team's instruments went haywire, trying to detect the supposedly dimensional energies they were convinced he was channeling. "The ritual cube absorbs his strikes," one scientist gasped. "Clearly, this is how humans harvest kinetic energy for their box-based combat." Kazor himself made regular appearances, usually with an entourage of warriors attempting to mimic Marcus's movements. The sight of 12 HFY trying to jump rope with their tentacles would be forever seared into Marcus's memory. "We have mastered your Earth technique of rope skipping," Kazor proclaimed one morning, as his warriors untangled themselves from what looked like the galaxy's most complicated macrame project. The best part was their attempt to recreate the sacred geometry of a boxing ring. Having misinterpreted the term completely, they'd spent 3 days trying to forge a giant ring to wear during combat, only to scrap the project when they couldn't figure out which tentacle it was supposed to go on. But beneath all the comedy, Marcus was getting himself into serious fighting shape. His muscles remembered the old rhythms, the patterns of movement that had made him champion. The cargo bay's artificial gravity was actually set slightly higher than Earth normal, making his training even more effective. During his evening sessions, when the crowd had thinned, he'd sometimes catch glimpses of other species, trying to imitate his techniques in their own corners of the cargo bay. A group of Voltarians had even rigged up their own version of a speed bag, though the electrical discharges made it a bit more exciting than the traditional version. "Your species continues to confound us," Ambassador Xylith commented during one late-night session. "You've turned combat into an art form, yet you claim to be a maintenance engineer." Marcus threw another combination at the heavy bag, each punch precise and measured. "Sometimes the best way to fix things isn't with a wrench," he replied, thinking of all the times boxing had fixed things in his life: bullies in school, self-doubt, and now, maybe, a little interspecies prejudice. "Besides," he added with a grin, "you should see what I can do with a proper set of gloves and someone who really needs an attitude adjustment." The main hangar of Delta 9 had been transformed. A regulation boxing ring stood in its center, looking somehow both out of place and perfectly at home among the sleek alien architecture. The CopyRetryAGwrite engineers had insisted on improving it with various technological additions, including what appeared to be a quantum containment field that they were convinced was necessary for proper box combat. "Sir," one of them approached Marcus as he wrapped his hands, "we've enhanced the ring with fifth-dimensional stabilizers to prevent any unwanted dimensional shifts during combat." "Thanks," Marcus replied, not bothering to explain that the only dimensions he'd be shifting were Kazor's perception of human capabilities. "Really appreciate the attention to detail." The crowd was unprecedented. Representatives from every species in the sector had turned up to witness this mysterious human combat ritual. The betting pools had reached such astronomical sums that the station's economic AI had temporarily crashed, trying to calculate the odds. And then Kazor made his entrance. Marcus had seen some interesting ring walk outfits in his day, but this was something special. The CopyRetryAGwrite champion had apparently based his interpretation of boxing attire on a corrupted data file that mixed Victorian-era boxing daguerreotypes with ancient gladiatorial records. The result was a costume that looked like what might happen if a steampunk octopus mugged a gladiator. Kazor wore what appeared to be a top hat modified to accommodate his third eye, a waistcoat with holes for his multiple tentacles, and boxing gloves on every single appendage. The traditional CopyRetryAGwrite battle armor underneath had been decorated with what someone clearly thought were traditional boxing motifs, including several actual boxes painted in gold. "I have prepared for your Earth combat ritual," Kazor announced, his tentacles swishing dramatically in their individually gloved glory. "I have studied the ancient ways of the box." "That's quite an outfit," Marcus commented, climbing through the ropes. His own attire was considerably more traditional: shorts, boots, and gloves. He'd managed to find some proper hand wraps in the station's earth goods store, though the shopkeeper had been convinced they were some kind of religious bandages. The referee, a neutral party from the Galactic Sports Federation, looked thoroughly confused about their role. They'd been provided with a hastily assembled rulebook that seemed to be a mixture of actual boxing regulations and what the CopyRetryAGwrite research team thought boxing should be. "Competitors ready," the referee's translator squeaked. "Please ensure all dimensional anchors are secured and all boxes are properly aligned." Marcus touched gloves with 3 of Kazor's tentacles. The others were still trying to figure out the proper ritualistic boxing greeting they were convinced must exist. The bell rang, though someone had modified it to play what they thought was traditional Earth boxing music. It sounded suspiciously like "Pop Goes the Weasel." Kazor came out aggressive, all tentacles swinging. It might have been intimidating if he hadn't been trying to remember the sacred boxing footwork his research team had discovered, which appeared to be based on classical dance steps. "You know," Marcus said, easily slipping the wild swings, "I don't think Fred Astaire ever won a heavyweight title." "Ah," Kazor exclaimed, throwing more tentacle-powered punches. "You invoke the names of your boxing gods. But I have studied the ancient masters: Rocky, Apollo, Mr. T." Marcus couldn't help but grin as he peppered Kazor's guard with quick jabs. "Maybe we should get you a mohawk after this." The CopyRetryAGwrite champion's strategy became clear, or at least clear in its confusion. He was attempting to implement every boxing technique his research team had identified, all at once. This included random shouts of Adrian, frequent attempts to run up non-existent stairs, and what appeared to be an interpretation of the rope a dope that involved actually trying to use his tentacles as ropes. Float like a Neptunian gas whale, sting like a Venusian acid bee, Khazor declared, throwing what he probably thought was a haymaker but looked more like interpretive dance. Marcus slipped the wild swing, his years of training taking over. Close, but I think Ali had better rhythm. The fight settled into a rhythm, Khazor, throwing increasingly desperate combinations with his many gloved tentacles, Marcus slipping, blocking, and countering with textbook precision. The crowd watched in fascination as the human supposedly primitive fighting style systematically dismantled the CopyRetryAGwrite champion's multi-armed assault. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus asked, ducking under a tentacle and landing a clean 1-2 combination. "You spent so much time studying boxing, you forgot to learn how to box." Khazor's scales shifted colors in frustration. "But I mastered the ancient earth training montage. I drank raw eggs. I punched frozen meat." "Yeah," Marcus replied, slipping another wild swing. "Rocky really has a lot to answer for." By round 3, Khazor was getting desperate. He attempted to implement what his research team had dubbed the ultimate boxing technique, a combination of every movie boxing finale he'd studied. The result was a bizarre sequence that involved him trying to throw a slow-motion punch while running up invisible stairs and shouting "Yo, Adrian" in all 3 of his mouths. Marcus saw his opening. As Khazor's tentacles tangled in their attempt at cinematic glory, he stepped in with a perfectly timed liver shot. As it turned out, CopyRetryAGwrite anatomy wasn't so different from human anatomy when it came to body shots. Khazor's eyes, all 3 of them, went wide. His tentacles did a sort of jazz hands gesture, gloves flying in all directions, and he folded like a very confused accordion. The referee started counting, though they were doing it in base 7 math. Because someone had confused 10 count with numerical theory, it didn't matter. Khazor was done, his dramatic outfit deflating along with his previously undefeated record. And that, Marcus said, helping the fallen champion up with genuine sportsmanship, is why sometimes the best technology is a well-placed left hook. The hangar erupted in chaos as betting debts were settled and various species tried to process what they'd just witnessed. The CopyRetryAGwrite research team was already frantically updating their boxing documents, though they seemed to be focusing on the importance of proper top hat placement in combat situations. Khazor, to his credit, took his defeat with grace once he regained consciousness. "That is, you have shown me the true way of the box," he declared, still slightly wobbly. "I must learn this ancient art properly." Marcus looked around at the crowded hangar, at the confused but impressed aliens, at the hastily constructed ring with its unnecessary quantum stabilizers, at his defeated opponent in his ridiculous outfit, and smiled. Sometimes the best way to bridge cultural differences was with a properly thrown punch. 3 months after the Great Box Battle, as it had been dubbed in station records, Marcus stood in his newly opened gym, watching Khazor attempt to master the speed bag. It was going about as well as you'd expect when someone with 8 tentacles tries to establish a rhythm, which is to say, it looked like a percussion concert being performed by a caffeinated octopus. "Remember," Marcus called out, "you don't need to hit it with all your tentacles at once. Boxing's about precision, not how many limbs you can throw at a problem." "But surely more punches equal more victory?" Khazor asked, still trying to coordinate his many appendages. He'd traded his elaborate battle armor for standard gym wear, though he'd insisted on keeping the top hat. Some traditions die hard. The gym itself was a testament to interspecies cooperation, even if it gave the station's insurance adjusters nervous breakdowns. Marcus had converted the cargo bay into Delta 9 Boxing Academy, where any number of arms is welcome. The membership roster read like a galactic census, with everyone from Voltarians who had to wear insulated gloves to prevent electrocuting their sparring partners to gaseous collective beings who required special containment rings to maintain humanoid form during workouts. "Your Earth combat science continues to humble me," Khazor admitted, finally managing to hit the speed bag with just 2 tentacles. "We spent millennia developing our 17 sacred combat forms, yet none addressed the importance of footwork and proper body rotation." "Yeah, well," Marcus grinned, holding the heavy bag for a young Xylaxian who was working on their jab. "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. Speaking of which, how's the CopyRetryAGwrite High Council taking all this?" Khazor's scales shifted to a slightly embarrassed shade of purple. They've officially classified boxing as an advanced combat form worthy of study, though they're still convinced the box part must have some deeper spiritual significance. The station's maintenance alerts had dropped by 70% since the gym opened. Turns out that having a constructive outlet for interspecies aggression did wonders for public relations. Even Dr. Kraltik had become a regular, though they spent more time documenting the sociological implications of regulated violence as a means of cultural exchange than actually training. You know, Marcus said, watching his diverse group of students practice their combinations. When I was fixing that ventilation leak all those months ago, I never thought it would lead to this. Indeed, Kazor agreed, having finally found a rhythm with the speed bag. Though I must ask, when do we progress to the advanced training? I have acquired several poultry specimens for pursuit, and I've located a suitable quantity of stairs. Let's stick to the basics for now, Marcus laughed. Though I might let you run up some stairs if you promise to leave the chicken alone. Above them, the station's environmental controls hummed smoothly, maintained by a new generation of engineers who had learned that sometimes the best way to fix a problem was to tackle it head-on, whether with a wrench or a well-placed left hook.